Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, in case there was any doubt as to who this is. And I had someone ask me a question on the Facebook fan page this morning, and they asked me, Jason, is it true that midgets are stronger than other people pound for pound? So we put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing, work on skilling on my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. This is a good topic. I mean, I've covered pound for pound strength and relative strength and all that stuff in the past, but I don't think it's a bad idea. Considering I've gained a few thousand followers since the last time I think I've talked about this, that, yeah, it's true. Height is one of the largest factors in your pound for pound strength on any of your basic lifts. And it's multifold in reason. And this is something, again, in strength sports they figured out a long time ago. That's the reason in strength sports no one uses body weight multipliers. They don't say that a guy who squats 2.1 times his body weight is stronger than someone who squats twice his body weight. That's not how they do it. They break people up into weight classes, and then for cross class you have different scores and formulas that are used to determine how strong people should be. And the reason for that is because pound for pound strength doesn't work. In other words, if you were to take a 5'5" guy and a 6'5" guy who started out untrained, put them both on the exact same training program under the same coach for the next 2 years, if they're properly coached and they're on a fantastic strength training program that maximizes strength, maximizes muscle size, all that stuff, the 6'5" guy is going to end up being a lot stronger than the 5'5" guy. His squat, bench, deadlift, overhead press, all those lifts, all of their lifts are going to most likely be quite a bit higher. But the 5'5" guy is going to have better multipliers. In other words, the 5'5" guy is going to reach a double body weight squat probably much sooner than the 6'5" guy, right? Much, much sooner. And in fact, it could be a year sooner. And his multiplier will almost always be higher. And it has to do with just some basic physics going on. I mean, the first one that should be obvious to a lot of people is distance moved. Because strength is actually relative to your muscle mass, and people forget that. There's a lot of research on that. People say, well, size doesn't equal strength. Well, that gets thrown out the window when drugs come into the equation, or when guys do tons of arm work and inject a lot of stuff in their arms and delts. Yeah, all that stuff will look bigger, but overall there's strong amounts of data showing that a person's max squat, for example, is the most correlated factor is their muscle mass adjusted for their height. In other words, like Greg Nuckols, Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, all those people, when they looked at this stuff and they studied it, that finding someone's max squat, their max squat, when they tested them, they could estimate it within 10% based off of that person's lean body mass formula adjusted for their height. Yeah, and that's because obviously you need more muscle through your whole body to have a larger amount of muscle mass. So a lot of people who just train their upper body might think they're really big, but you're really not. That's why you see a fair amount of guys who only do upper body who might weigh 180, 185 pounds or even less, who look like they have a really big upper body and no legs, because things like a lot of their back, their glutes, their legs aren't carrying much muscle. So they end up carrying sometimes 10 pounds or more less muscle than they should have. So they end up not having that much muscle when you check their overall body. But yeah, because the squat uses most of the muscles in the body, and we know that size is enormously correlated with strength. It's actually the biggest factor. In fact, the biggest factor in how much force any muscle can generate in your body is how big it is. Now, you've got individual levers, you've got technique, all that stuff that come into play, so you can't calculate it exactly. Muscle fiber distribution affects it slightly. So there's all those things to look at. But they can calculate it based on that. But they have to adjust for height. So the reason height matters so much, the first one is very, very obvious. Distance moved. In other words, to deadlift or squat, or even bench press because of arm length, taller people tend to have longer arms. But the obvious one is distance moved on most of these lifts, particularly things like the squat, particularly things like the deadlift. The deadlift really is an enormous factor. It's one reason we've noted that the deadlift is the least correlated out of any of the big three to your body weight when it's been looked at champions. In other words, it's not uncommon for a world record in a lighter weight class to be higher than the class above them. It happens because the amount of muscle isn't as relative as proportions on the body. In other words, the shorter your legs and the longer your arms, the more likely you are to have a really, really good deadlift once you build a muscle mass base and you learn the lift. And the guys with shorter arms and longer legs are going to struggle more. You're having to move the weight further. So in general, the shorter a person is, things like deadlift very obviously become one of the most obvious lifts because the distance gets dramatically shortened. And if someone is a midget, and I'm not even sure how we define that anymore. I know there's a number of height and all of that. I don't even know what it is. But if we know based upon all of that shorter people in general are going to have better ratios than taller people, obviously the shorter you are, the easier it is. It's going to be the deadlift because you move the weight a shorter distance. Furthermore, the shorter your legs are, you're not really pulling the same from the floor. You can actually oftentimes pull with higher hips and everything else. You can get a better biomechanical advantage. All right, so the distance moved is a factor because to move 400 pounds, I don't care what lift it is, 400 pounds, it requires more energy, more strength, and more force to move 400 pounds 20 inches than it does 12 inches. And this is basic physics. Which one's a bigger feat of strength? Well, to move the same weight a further distance. It's harder. It requires more work. And if all you could do, if your absolute max is moving that weight 12 inches, then obviously moving it 20 inches requires more force and more strength than you might technically possess. So this is one of the big factors in height right there. It's just about distance move. It's about distance move. And then we get into individual leverages. We get into leverages because, again, limb lengths can affect biomechanics. They can affect biomechanics, and it's almost never positive. The only exception being where longer arms shorten the distance a weight has to move. And the deadlift is the only exercise really that I can think of to where the total distance moved is adjusted for that. Maybe power cleans and stuff. But generally speaking, longer arms are going to hurt you on all the upper body lifts. So in other words, the shorter your arms are, you think about a bench press, the shorter the distance you're going to have to move. And it can oftentimes affect how far the humerus and everything rotates. It can affect how much shoulder rotation happens on these different exercises, which can put you in a biomechanical disadvantage. Longer arms can put you at very serious mechanical disadvantages from the moment arms. And it can be the same thing with longer legs. When you think of something like a squat or a deadlift, the longer a person's legs are, oftentimes their knees, hips, everything else can be put into more disadvantaged positions on these exercises at the far end of the range of motion. Things like knees can get further in the way trying to deadlift it, so you've got to adjust for that more and more. And account for the fact that, again, they're going to lose leverage advantages. It can affect bar pass, everything else, but mainly it can affect the moment arms and the lever and the way levers are put and stuff. So yeah, the taller you are, the more disadvantaged you are on different exercises. The more disadvantaged you are, and the shorter you are, the easier these exercises are on a weight perspective. So in other words, you're just moving the weight usually a shorter distance, oftentimes with biomechanical advantages. So if you're a short guy, like a guy who's 5'4", it's not hard for them to get really good pound for pound strength relative to someone who's tall. Whereas when you go back to the other point, when you start getting real tall, like above 6 foot, and every inch matters here, guys. I mean, generally speaking, if you have two guys with similar genetic potential who've trained the same way, say side by side, each guy, if you were to take 5 of them, you could probably organize them by height, and odds are every inch difference between all of them is probably going to be a slight advantage or disadvantage in terms of pound for pound strength. Right? That's going to be advantage or disadvantage. And ultimately, till you get to the guys who are real tall, a guy who's 6'4", 6'5", is going to tend to have a terrible pound for pound strength, but he's going to have more strength potential. He's going to have more strength potential because in spite of all of those disadvantages, he's still going to have more muscle mass on his frame. Yes, he will have to move the weight a further distance. Yes, it will be more difficult from a force generation perspective for this person to lift any given weight compared to these other guys. he's at a disadvantage there. But his frame will allow him to gain muscle more quickly, and it will allow him to have more total muscle mass. So at the end of the day, the taller you are, the greater your potential for overall strength. You know, your pound for pound strength is going to suck. You know, unless you're just amazing and at the elite level. It's probably going to suck in comparison, but your absolute strength is going to be beastly. And that's where you start looking at some of these world's strongest man competitors. Very few of these guys are ever under 6 foot. They're all tall. And the same thing when you go into heavier weight classes in powerlifting. The taller guys can have better absolute strength. They can have much better absolute strength. In other words, a guy who's really tall is going to have a much better chance of eventually squatting 700 pounds, of eventually bench pressing 500 pounds. Even though their levers are at a disadvantage, their frame can hold so much more muscle that they have so much more potential for strength. It's just that ratio might suck. A guy who's 6'5" or 6'6", a 700 squat on a pound for pound scale might not be that amazing. And that's just the way it works, guys. So again, yes, obviously a midget is going to have a pound for pound strength that is going to be better than average height people, right? And it's just basic physics involved here, guys. Basic physics and leverages. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.